All right, man, peace. So, brothers, this is going to be a new series that I'm starting called What is Blackness? And Volume 1, the initial edition or first entry, is going to be featuring none other than Mr. Russell Wilson, the superstar quarterback of the Seattle Seahawks. And the reason why I want to start this series is because, as we're going to see over the course of this segment, where Shannon Sharpe and Skip Bayless attempt to converse about why Russell Wilson seems to be the butt of certain jokes that one might either construe or misconstrue, maybe depending on your perspective, to be racially tinged. An attempt to compartmentalize Russell Wilson due to other people's notions of what quote-unquote blackness is. And I definitely want to address this because, as I always state, and as I always tell you, brothers, there's no such thing as black. Black is not a race. Black is not a history. Black is not a culture. Black is not a landmass. Black is not a belief system. So once you capitulate to the sentiment or the teachings or the ideologies of anyone who tries to force or push quote-unquote blackness on you, all you're agreeing to is a straw man concept. And once you've agreed to that straw man concept, you're basically opening the door to a bizarro universe, a twilight zone, where rules are concocted on the fly and you have to go along to those fake rules. And that means that you end up living a fake life. There is no such thing as black. That's why there are so many of these conversation pieces that go nowhere. It's just circular conversation because everyone is just a dog chasing its own tail. You're just a rabbit chasing after a carrot that you're never going to catch. This false concept of quote unquote equality. You can only invest in the concept of equality once you've accepted these false racial designations like black and white, because once again, black and white are inextricably linked. You cannot have one without the other. So once you as a so-called black man believe that you are actually that means that you forever, for perpetuity, are going to have to be linked to the so-called white man. You need each other to counterbalance. But when you accept real history and real culture, you're no longer defined by your opposite. You're defined by yourself. And once you're defined by yourself, people don't have the ability to confine you or categorize you or marginalize you or anything like that. Because you can go back to real history and find out who you are. So anyway, they're going to talk about it. I'm going to chime in.
So over the weekend, Twitter has taken a run at Russell Wilson's goody two-shoes personality. Jokes about the Seahawks quarterback have been trending that include saying Russ thinks drinking coffee is living on the edge. He plays go fish on team plane rides and says, dag nabbit.
The real issue with Russell Wilson, just speaking from a two-dimensional perspective, the real issue with Russell Wilson is really nuanced. Because so-called black people, they love talking about how they're stereotyped by the Caucasian and by other races. But so-called black people stereotype one another. So-called black people try to force other so-called black people to abide by their own personal definitions of what quote-unquote blackness is, depending on how you speak, what your quote-unquote religious or spiritual beliefs are, who you're with in a quote-unquote relationship and why you're with them, so on and so forth. Don't get it twisted. There are reasons why. There are certain stipulations when it comes to who you link up with in a relationship, but those are culturally based. So we have to get back to real culture so that we can show people why you're supposed to be with someone. But in America, which I call modern day Babylon, and that's why I tell you brothers all the time, I don't spend too much time focusing on who someone is with in a relationship because all of these females are Babylonian. If a female accepts that she's quote unquote black, that means that she's a black Babylonian or a white Babylonian or a Puerto Rican or Dominican Babylonian. If they've been westernized, they're Babylonian. You understand that? But once you go back to ancestral cultures, now you can show and convey why you're supposed to be with someone from your culture so that you can perpetuate your culture and have it carry on to further generations. You understand that? That's really what Deuteronomy 7:3 is about. And some of the passages in Nehemiah, Ezra, so on and so forth. A lot of men like to pull those scriptures without proper context. Oh, this is why you're supposed to be with a black woman. No, it's not. Because the Bible does not have a categorization of humankind called black. That doesn't exist. So that's a presumption on your part that black equals quote unquote Israelite, or person of the Most High, or person of the scriptures, or the chosen people per se. In order for you to align yourself with the scriptures to the best of your ability, yes, the seed line is essential, but you also have to have the spirit. So it's the elect of the Most High that the Bible's talking about, not Israel in the flesh, but you have to have the flesh and the spirit. But just getting back to the point, we tend to stereotype one another, and the stereotypes that we like to reinforce are normally negative. You have to make sure that you know that you're niggerish enough, to be quite honest with you, and Russ doesn't have that. We're going to see Shannon Sharpe make an assumption that's based in a lot of the subliminal thinking that he does, if you want to call it that. Maybe subliminal reacting per se. But he's going to make an assumption about Russell Wilson's lineage that is going to shed some light on what part of the problem is.
Countless other jokes we don't have time to mention. Shannon, how do you explain this? What is going on?
Well, he's gotten a rep for the way he carries himself, Skip. He's very unique. I mean, he came into the league, Russell was married. And so the guys that, you know, a lot of guys come into the league, they're single and they're talking about one thing. Russ has a wife at home. So he's not engaging in the...
And beyond that, you know, let's keep it real. Because Russell is a so-called black man who was married to a so-called white woman, early in his life, I believe that they were married by the time he was 21 or 22. That's another reason why that may have caused some alienation between himself and his teammates. Because they're looking at him like they're expecting him to be single, because a lot of cats are expecting him to play the field until he gets, you know, old enough to settle down with someone. Not only because he's a professional athlete, but also because he's a so-called black professional athlete. A lot of those guys probably did not come from homes where the father and the mother were quote-unquote married. Some of them probably did, but many of them probably didn't. Because once again, the so-called black community is the most effeminized of all communities. The so-called black male is the biggest simp on the planet Earth. It's not even a close second. That's why I tell you brothers all the time, you know, when you see these white boys from middle America talking about the war against white men, that's a real thing. Because the powers that be consider the quote-unquote Caucasian man in America to be the last bastion, at least in Western society, of the quote-unquote patriarchy. They don't even consider the so-called black man as a threat, because they understand that he's been broken down so much by the quote-unquote black matriarchy. They don't consider him a threat. The average so-called black man thinks and reacts and responds like a woman does. Shannon Sharpe is a great example of that. He's extremely, extremely effeminate in his methods of thinking.
That normally guys that are single coming into the league 21, 22 years of age.
And don't get it twisted. The so-called Caucasian, the westernized Caucasian, is a big simp also. But a lot of them are still trying to hold out that old style machismo. And that's why they're the focus of the mainstream liberal media, trying to break them down. That's why they're constantly speaking about taking away gun rights and gun reform and gun control. All of these things are meant to take away the power, to disempower the so-called Caucasian from middle America, because they consider the so-called Caucasian on the coast as a half a bitch.
Engaging in, and I was very mindful of that. Guys that were married, I watched the way I talked in front of them. He's also a man of faith. So the swearing and the things that are going on in the locker room, he's not a part of that. And a lot of times, you know, and you look at it like, well, hold on, bro, you know, and he wasn't engaging in that, Skip. But I think the crux of it.
Right, but finish your sentence, Shannon Sharpe. Hold on, bro, you know what? Like, what? Finish your sentence. There's so many times when Shannon Sharpe speaks and he just breaks off his sentence before he finishes it. Maybe because he's embarrassed about what he's going to say if he finishes the sentence. Because what he was alluding to is the quote-unquote peer pressure of this pseudo concept of blackness, where you're supposed to get amongst these other cats in a cipher, and just a lot of times, to be honest with you, talk a lot of ignorance and a lot of nonsense. Don't get it twisted. You know, there are a lot of ciphers that brothers get into that are edifying and elucidating and fun and funny, but other times maybe you just don't want to be bothered with the simple level of the conversation. And people like a Russell Wilson, depending on how he was raised, might not, you know, they might not want to get down with those type of convos.
This happens a lot in our community. And I think the people in our community that's watching the show understand what I'm talking about. There's levels to blackness here.
Now, brothers, did you hear that? That's why I'm starting this series. Shannon Sharpe, being the toxic, liberal, so-called black male that he is, he basically is going to subscribe to this concept, number one, of quote-unquote blackness. Number two, that there are quote-unquote levels to blackness. Brothers, there's no such thing as black culture. So there can be no such thing as levels of blackness. And the interesting thing is, once again, a lot of these so-called social justice warriors, they're the same ones who are now preaching on the internet or on social media or what have you in their protests that being black is not a signifier of personality or beliefs that they should subscribe to. But so-called black people are the ones many times who try to force other so-called blacks to fit into this box or these boxes of blackness, whatever that means.
Look at Russell Wilson and you look at Patrick Mahomes, they're a lot more alike than, say, Cam Newton and Lamar Jackson.
Why is that, Shannon?
The first two guys I mentioned, Patrick Mahomes and Russell Wilson, they're biracial.
No, they're not. So clearly, you did not do your research, Shannon Sharpe, because Patrick Mahomes can be described as quote-unquote biracial, even though you are whatever your father is. So Patrick Mahomes actually is what will be described as a so-called black man, but even that in and of itself is a fiction. If we want to go literal, Patrick Mahomes would be the descendant of the people of the book, because that's what his father is. Now, when we look at Russell Wilson, both of his parents are black aboriginals, so-called black aboriginals of America. He's on record as stating that his father is a so-called Native American, quote-unquote Native American. What he really means is an Aboriginal American, because his father was not a Mongoloid. You understand that? So this is the problem. There's a lack of nuance. There's a lack of understanding in these conversations that liberal blacks like to have. And Shannon Sharpe has styled himself and cast himself as a spokesman for so-called black people. He's cast himself as a gatekeeper when it comes to topics of race. And he doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. And that's the problem. They want to cast these actors and these athletes and these entertainers as so-called black leaders, and they're not fucking qualified.
And so they're always being looked at, and there's a stigma that goes with our community.
Wait, who'd you say is biracial? I lost you.
Russell Wilson. And is it Russell Wilson?
I don't think he is.
You don't think he is?
No, he is not. No, he is not.
Pretty sure he's not.
Okay. I look at him and Mahomes.
Patrick.
Oh, yeah, I know Patrick Mahomes.
Kudos to Skip Bayless for correcting him.
Well, also, my bad. Okay. Sorry. I look at those.
Right, but how are you going to have a segment about this and you didn't even look it up, bro? So you assumed that Russell Wilson was quote-unquote biracial. Why? Because he does not have what you would classify as pure quote-unquote Negroid features? Or his hair is not woolly enough for you? Our people have been convinced that if they see a so-called black person who looks anything other than a Wesley Snipes or Shannon Sharpe type, that person must be the product of admixture, and that is not the case.
Personality is more alike, as opposed to Cam Newton and Lamar Jackson.
Yeah.
And I think the thing is that when you're fair complected, when you're light skinned, people automatically think, oh, you think you're white. Russell has the good hair.
More nigga nonsense. Actually, what Shannon should have done, he should have scrapped his whole attempt at a point once Skip Bayless corrected him and let him know that Russell Wilson is not mixed, quote unquote mixed. Because it's obvious that the foundation of his statement, of his soliloquy per se, is that because Russell Wilson and Pat Mahomes are quote unquote mixed, or mulatto as I say sometimes, that is why their personality is the way that it is. But if you're going to say that, now you have to expound on what you notice about their personality. Are you saying what? They're less aggressive? They're less quote-unquote black? There's a level of blackness that they can't get to because they're mixed per se? Is that what you're trying to allege, or is that what you're trying to say? Because what that does is that leads to another psychosis, what I call the tortured mulatto psychosis. I didn't make that term up. Other cats have used it. It's something that I do use and utilize in my videos because it is apt. That is definitely a true thing. There is such a thing as the quote-unquote tortured mulatto. There's no doubt about that. Someone who's trying to compensate for their own levels of insecurity when it comes to where they fit in as a quote-unquote black person, because they've been told that they're not quote-unquote black enough, or they feel like they're not quote-unquote black enough. So they try to overdo it and not only become involved in social justice issues, but they want to lead those issues. We see that with the Kenny Stills of the world and the Colin Kaepernicks of the world. These are people who decide they want to get on the front lines and get in the front of the front lines and help the darkies find their way to the light. And that's just, honestly, that's just a problem being compounded on top of another problem.
And this goes back to slave skill, because when you're light skinned, you normally got to work in the house, and when you're...
Is that the case, Shannon Sharp? Can you prove that for a fact? Now notice, even in Quentin Tarantino's film Django, the head house slave was not a so-called light-skinned black man. Many times the so-called house Negro was allowed to be basically the first assistant of the quote-unquote man of the house or the lord of the manor, based on his loyalty. Many times because he was raised alongside of that man of the house, that Caucasian head of the plantation. And he was trusted in that way because they were raised together. It wasn't because they were light-skinned. Now, if the quote-unquote master went out there and copulated with a black female slave, a so-called black female slave, and made a child, if he cared about the child at all, sometimes he might bring that child into the house. But the decision over whether or not a so-called slave was allowed in the house or in the fields wasn't necessarily based on skin color. That's a lot of that Willie Lynch bullshit, that fiction that was pushed forth by the pro-blackities back in the mid-1960s, because they were trying to explain away a lot of their own personal issues pertaining to the differences of skin tone and hair texture, etc. So they concocted that document known as the Willie Lynch letter and spread it out amongst so-called black people. And still to this day, many of the wokies believe that that's a real thing. That thing is not real. The Willie Lynch letter is not real. There's far more nuance that was involved in the concept of slavery than what these wokies and these pseudo quote-unquote Afrocentric people are able to explain. And Shannon Sharp does not really know what the fuck he's talking about at all. But slavery in and of itself, that's a very, very complex topic. As I've stated many times in the past, the overall paradigm of slavery being Caucasian over so-called black men, that really was not the case until the late 1700s going into the early 1800s. That's when it started to become predominantly Caucasian slave master over quote-unquote black slave. Before that, you had black slave masters who had both black and white slaves. You had white quote-unquote slave masters who had Caucasian slaves or black slaves. But it started to move more to the overall structure of the Caucasian presiding over the so-called black man and woman in the mid to late 1700s. There's no way in the world you're going to have a whole race of people in hardcore bondage for that elongated a period of time. But the reason why that understanding of slavery is pushed and promoted today is as an ego boost for the Caucasian, who spent most of his existence as a slave, where they were known as Slavs or serfs back in Europe. And even when they came to America, they were nothing but white trash. The vast majority of these so-called Caucasians are nothing but white trash and the descendants of white trash. It's just facts. They didn't own any slaves, the vast majority of them, during the time of slavery. But now, because of what's taught in the history books, you have all of these so-called black people looking at all of these so-called Caucasians as the descendants of slave masters, and that's not the case at all. And what that does is it stops us from believing in one another. It stops us from engaging in commerce with one another. And it also stops us from stopping interlopers from coming into our communities, establishing businesses, and raping our neighborhoods dry of resource. Because as soon as these other races try to set up shop in our neighborhoods, set up their businesses, we're supposed to be protesting. We're supposed to be picketing. We're supposed to be boycotting their businesses and driving them out. Because you can best believe a so-called black man cannot open up a business in Chinatown, anywhere in the U.S. A so-called black man cannot go to an East Indian or an Arabic community in America and open up a business. Hell, a so-called black man can barely open up a business in a so-called black community. So the real warfare is economic warfare, and where and how we spend our money and why. So we don't like to spend money amongst each other because we don't trust one another. And for some strange reason, there's a certain segment of our people who do not like to see other members of their quote-unquote nation or race of people do well. For some strange reason, we seem to believe that we deserve to get things for free from people who look like us. And it's exactly the opposite. It's the people who look like us who we should be paying. It's the people of the other races that we should not be giving our money to. And that's how you automatically cause a paradigm shift and a power shift in this society.
You hit the fields. The light skin came from, you probably had some of the master's blood in your system.
Lies. Once again, this is basic nigga nonsense. These are things that are propagated to once again always make sure that the so-called Caucasian is viewed as a boogeyman and as this master overlord. If you're anything other than deep dark brown, it's because somewhere up the line, the white master has sex with your great-great-great-grandmother. It is not the case. That is not true. As a matter of fact, even according to the Caucasian geneticists and their tests and their studies, they claim that the most ancient people in the world are the San tribesmen from South Africa. And when you look up the San tribesmen, spelled S as in Sam, A as in Apple, N as in Nancy, they're all lighter skinned. So this notion that, variances in melanated peoples comes from, forced sex upon black women by white slave masters, that's something that once again is taught in the history books so that black people, so-called black people, look at the Caucasian as their dad.
We already looked at you kind of funny because we felt you were getting treated differently. And I think the thing is that that's how they view Russell in the Legion of Boom.
I will say this. The notion of quote-unquote lighter-skinned Negroes or people with quote-unquote good hair being treated better, that is a real thing, and that is a substantive thing. Because the Caucasian has been set up as a standard of beauty. So anyone who looks closer to him then looks closer to, someone like a Shannon Sharpe or Wesley Snipes, they are going to gain a certain level of favor. Because they've conquered the world for the most part. This is their time to rule, so they establish the standards.
The thing that I love most about him is that he never, moved away from who he is. He ain't try to be hard. He ain't come there and listen to no rap music, get no tattoo. Say,
Well, I'm not quite sure about that. I think that he's made certain attempts to raise his cool points. He just doesn't have it. And that's okay. That's okay. You know what they call the cool dudes? They call them baby daddies. They call them dudes who have to go back and forth to court because they have 4 different baby mamas because he got so much swag that the women can't stay away from him until they get tired of him, until they get tired of his act, until they get tired of his game. Right? When a dude has a lot of game, what's that mean? That means he's a great liar. Once they figure out that that dude is a great liar, infatuation turns into disgust. So don't worry about whether or not people find you appealing. You have to love yourself, man, because most of these people ain't shit anyway. Who cares about what they like?
That's not who he was. And he says he's embraced who he is. Yeah. And if you look at the defense, the Legion of Boom, and this was the team that was carried by their defense. You look at Cam, and you look at Sherm, and you look at Bobby. You look at those guys. They kind of gravitated towards offensively beast mode.
Yeah, because no disrespect to beast mode, aka Marshawn Lynch, but he exuded the energy of an ignorant Negro. I mean, he just did. He exuded the energy of someone who was from a more disenfranchised environment. And that's a major issue that exists amongst the various strata of our people. Some of our people who come from the more disenfranchised backgrounds, they're very insecure about so-called black people who come from more advantageous backgrounds. For example, Jalen Rose, when he called out Grant Hill because of Grant Hill's background. Why is that? Because Jalen Rose was jealous. And he even admitted it, that he was jealous of Grant Hill's background. The fact that he had a father and a mother who loved him and he came from a relatively wealthy neighborhood. So, I mean, I noticed that as well, that the Legion of Boom gravitated more towards Marshawn Lynch than they did Russell Wilson, but that doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, Russell Wilson has been the best player on the Seattle Seahawks for years. For years. And to Russell Wilson's credit, to his credit, even though the media never mentions this, and we know the Legion of Boom never mentions this, Marshawn Lynch never mentions this, but for an all-time great defense to give up, around 200 yards to Tom Brady in the fourth quarter of that game, to give up a double-digit lead in the fourth quarter of that game, and you have the nerve to blame Pete Carroll and Russell Wilson for losing the game, they should be ashamed of their damn selves. Now, did Pete Carroll make the wrong call? Probably. Did Russell Wilson maybe not do as good a job as he could have of selling that play, trying to trick the defense? Maybe. But at the end of the day, if you have an all-time great defense and you give up a double-digit lead in the fourth quarter of the Super Bowl and you allow Tom Brady to throw for around 200 yards in the fourth quarter, I don't want to hear shit from you.
Weezmo from Oaktown. He's in your face. He's on the edge. That's how we are. They look at Doug Baldwin. Doug Baldwin was a guy that was undrafted. Fought your tooth and nail. And then they look at Russ like, you old goody two-shoes, bro. You up there listening to the old bull jive music play, go fish. Bro,
in other words, your fatherless nigga nonsense altar was coming out. Your insecure black matriarchal altar was coming out. That's what you really mean. Because if you're secure within yourself, you're not worried about what the next man is listening to. You don't care. You know, bro, do you? As long as you're not disrespecting me or the environment, breaking any laws, do what you have to do.
Of us, you ain't down. But the thing is with Russ, he hadn't changed. And now Russ got Sierra. They're like, whoa, how this corny? They look at him like, dude, you.
On a three-dimensional level, I'm going to speak now. The reason why Russell Wilson has Sierra is because they're in an arranged relationship. Sierra is under the MK Ultra program, and so is Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson is a Monarch athlete. I might do an epilogue to this video to just delve into that a bit deeper. But Sierra is definitely an asset within the industry, and Russell Wilson is an asset within the sports world. Once again, the sports world is just another component of the entertainment industry, as is the political world. Politics, sports, music, acting, all different branches on the same tree, pertaining to, the utilization of assets to spread Luciferianism, so on and so forth. But Russell Wilson is a Monarch athlete, and that's why he was linked up with Sierra. Now, their relationship could end depending on what the script is, but he's almost like a Stepford husband. Like you've heard of the concept of a Stepford wife. He's a Stepford husband. She has his keys. Sierra does.
How? Why?
He did.
He did.
Yeah.
So Skip, I think that's the part of it that Russ, he just embraces it. I mean, but Skip, you have to understand, now he plays the quarterback position. And when you try to be something that you're not, guys see that and they call you fake, they call you phony. I don't believe this is an act for Russ. I believe this is who he is. He's embraced who he is. And I don't get the problem with why people think that, I guess because you're black, you're supposed to, have tattoos, you're supposed to be, maybe have your hair cornrowed or dressed.
Well, it depends on what the comments were that were being made on Twitter. Maybe the comments were far more innocent than you guys are trying to imply, and you're just using this as another excuse to talk about race at a very low level, which is the only level that you guys are able to talk about race because y'all know shit about race. I would have had to have read the Twitter comments, for myself. Maybe those people were just trolling Russell in a good-natured way. Maybe it was racially tinged. Who knows? But I find that most of the racially tinged commentary towards Russell comes from so-called black people, not from the so-called Caucasian.
Wait, no, I mean, this is who he is. What you see is what you get, and I'm perfectly okay with that.
Last night, Twitter wasn't. Although you can make the case Twitter was just having fun with it. It didn't seem too mean-spirited to me from what I read of that thread. But this label has hung over him.
It has.
His whole career. And just to frame this discussion, I appreciate everything you just said. I go back to Mike Freeman writing in the Bleacher Report back on October 22nd of 2014. This team is the defending Super Bowl champion after crushing Peyton and company.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
What was it, 41-9 or
44-8, something like.
That was one of the worst ass whoopings I've ever seen in the Super Bowl. Like, just off the top of my head, when I think of the worst ass whoopings I've ever seen, I think of that one, and I think of the 49ers beating up on Denver, and I think of course, the second Dallas Cowboys Super Bowl against the Buffalo Bills. Oh no, the first one. Those were the worst ass whoopings I've ever seen.
That was a terrible game. I happened to be there for that one.
You were. You're a Bronco by blood.
I am.
And that was a hard one to get through.
It was.
Okay, so they're coming off that, and now we're mid-season, and Mike Freeman, who is African-American, wrote for the Bleacher Report, there's also an element of race that needs to be discussed. My feeling on this, and it's backed up by several interviews with Seahawks players, is that some of the black players think Wilson isn't black enough.
Yes.
Right, but what does that mean? Once again, these type of silly conversations and confrontations, maybe even altercations occur once you decide to accept the straw man known as black as a racial designation. So now you've accepted that straw man, now you must walk through that door into that fake world.
So we're going all the way back to mid-2014, and they're on their way to a second straight Super Bowl. And you definitely know what happened at the end of that Super Bowl. Pete Carroll said, I'm going to put the ball in Russ's hands, not in Beast Mode's hands. And you and I have gone back and forth, but the point was the play did not work. Even though I thought the throw was good enough to work, but Malcolm Butler undid it. And he snatched it in a Houdini-esque way that I've never seen happen at the end of a Super Bowl, certainly. And the rest is history because the Legion...
The ending of that game was so traumatizing. Even to me as a viewer. And I wasn't a Seattle Seahawks fan at all. But just watching that game, the way that it ended, it was like so hurtful and like deeply traumatizing to watch how that thing ended. I remember just watching the ending of that game and then going to work the next day and telling all the dudes on my job, Seattle will never go back to another Super Bowl. Ever. You could see how the trust was just lost at that moment. They were so traumatized.
You correctly pointed out, that was the beginning of the end of the Legion of Boom, because suddenly Pete Carroll was forced to, John Schneider, GM, forced to start to choose between the quarterback who, quote unquote, isn't black enough and the Legion of Boom who's saying, what did you just do?
And when I say that Seattle will never go back to another Super Bowl, I'm not talking about the franchise will never go back. I was talking about that incarnation of the team. I knew that they were going to have to wipe that team clean of the vast majority of the players. And it was obvious that they were going to start with the defense because those guys were so emotional. The next incarnation of the team was going to have to be built around Russell Wilson because he was the only one who was stable-minded enough to be able to move past what occurred.
Prior to that, Skip, maybe a lot of that was pointed at Russ. But for the first time, some of that anger and vitriol was pointed at Pete Carroll, which had never happened before.
No. Okay. So now, here's what's fascinating to me about this. I get it. He can be a little goody two-shoes, a little lame, cliched. I get all that. And yet, can you be too religious? Can you be too good of a dad? Can you be too good of a husband? I don't know. Because to me, he's really good at all the above.
He is.
And here's the flip of that. When he is on the football field, especially with the game on the line in the fourth quarter, he's hard.
Right.
No doubt about it. That's a pause, by the way, but no doubt about it. When Russell's out there on that damn football field, he's as tough as they come.
He is as tough mentally. He has as much dog in him as anybody who ever played that position to me.
Yes.
Like Brady's got dog in him, but it doesn't manifest the same way. Russ just makes play after play after play. Arm, legs, guts, will, giving up his body, taking punishment.
Right.
Man, you can't call him soft on a football field, right?
Right.
It's the flip side of everything I was reading last night on Twitter.
Because, Skip, when you look, but there's always, and people like, well, Shannon race, but there's always a race element. Because
Shannon said, well, people like, well, Shannon race. In other words, Shannon knows that he's starting to become known as the guy who tries to find a racial component to everything. And when you do that, you tend to swing and miss more. When people are always trying to go the race route for every conversation, it's normally because they don't really know what they're talking about. Race is a major issue, so it should be treated in a major way of seriousness, not just as a ploy to get attention for yourself because you're on television.
Tom Brady's corny.
He is.
But that's expected of a white guy playing quarterback.
But not religious.
Right.
Yeah.
So you look at some of these other guys, and Peyton would do some things, but we see Peyton's personality. But it's almost like you're black, you need to act.
By the way, Peyton can be corny clever, like corny funny.
Yeah.
Peyton Manning I find to be very entertaining. I have to give him credit. He is a funny dude. When he hosted the ESPYs, I thought he did a great job.
Funny, where you say,
he doesn't have a problem making fun of himself.
Correct.
And so I think that's what sets Peyton apart. But I think the thing is, when you get a black quarterback and you're black, it's like, well, I want to see that blackness. But Russell.
Right, but what is that? Notice they keep using this term black and blackness, not pertaining to quote unquote race, but pertaining to personality or beliefs or culture or what have you. Once again, so-called black people like to do to one another what they claim they don't want the so-called white man to do to them, which is stereotype them and put them in certain boxes to where they can't be themselves as an individual.
I'm a quarterback. Yes, I'm black. I happily embrace who and what I am.
Allegedly.
I'm a quarterback, and I think quarterbacks act a certain way, and Russ has understood that. That I can't, there are certain things that as a quarterback of a football team, Skip, I can't do, say, like a cornerback or the running back or the defensive lineman. But there's always been levels to this where he or she is not black enough. Because, Skip, I remember, you know, if you were smart and growing up black, oh, you think you white.
Yeah.
Anytime that you did something that, no, I just don't want to be, you know, no, I'm not thinking I'm white. I'm just, you know, I do my homework, I read.
Well, that's part of the toxic, that's part of the toxic component or the toxic element of the so-called black community that exists in the school system. And I mentioned this in another video. When these people start talking about, oh, you know, our school is bad, is the school bad or are the kids that go to the school bad? Because all the school is another building. I mean, I'm not quite sure how you can have a bad school unless you have bad people in the school. You go to school to listen to what the teacher says, take your notes, study, read, do your homework, rinse, wash, repeat. You know? So, I mean, the purpose of you going to school is to listen to what the teacher says, take your notes, read, do your homework, wash, rinse, repeat. That's it. If you're going to school to look cool or join cliques or, you know, these other ulterior motives, then yes, the culture of this school is going to be hurt.
Educated, but there's always that. We get that a lot now. We getting that with Vice President candidate Kamala Harris. She ain't black enough.
Well, according to her, she's not black at all. She tries to align herself to her quote unquote South Asian roots when it's convenient for her. But that's a whole other video and a whole other topic.
With a white man, her parents are this and that. See, that's how we do in the community. We just pick each other apart. What for what?
Well, Shannon, here's the issue with that, because once again, you're trying to conflate two different topics and two different issues. When it comes to Russell Wilson, he's getting addressed and assaulted for his personality. When it comes to Kamala Harris, she's getting addressed for her track record politically and also her own personal history. Those are two different things, but because you're a toxic, democratic, liberal black, you just can't get that shit off your mind. You're always trying to inject political talk into, you know, these basic segments and conversations. And I think that Skip Bayless tolerates it because he just needs you as his partner, but it's very annoying. Kamala Harris is another actress.
So, do I think Russell Wilson curses off camera? Do I think there's a hidden side to him? I don't. I don't know that for sure, but I'm going to guess no.
Right.
Okay, so let's look at the flip side of this. I always tell you, when LeBron James is doing a public interview, national TV, and he curses, and sometimes he even uses the F word,
right.
I tell you, it makes me cringe because he is a role model.
Right.
He's I promise. And I think, LeBron, you're better than that. You don't need to. It's just gratuitous.
No, Skip Bayless. Actually, he does need to do that in his own mind, because LeBron has to keep selling himself as this dude who came from the hood out of nowhere, and he's so incredulous that he made it into the NBA. I'm just a kid from Akron, and my mother was poor and broke and blah, blah, blah. He does not want anyone to know that basically he was sponsored from when he was 11, 12 years old. How the fuck could you not make it to the NBA, dude? You're 6'8", 250 pounds, and have a 45-inch vertical leap. If you didn't make it into the NBA in some capacity, you would have been the biggest failure in modern athletic sports history.
Get you anywhere,
right,
but it does get you this far. When he's on the shop, obviously,
right,
then that's HBO. He's just going to let it fly.
Right.
But it does get you this. It allows people who love him to say, well, at least he's being real.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Raw real. That's real LeBron, because off camera.
Right.
Yeah, he's going to drop some bombs.
Skip, I think the thing is that fans want to realize, well, how authentic or how real is what I'm watching is that person off camera.
Mm-hmm.
Is he really like that? And that's the thing, Skip. People want to know, you really like that? Does he really talk like that? Is that really how he feels? And when LeBron is speaking, they're like, he's doing this he's talking like this on camera. Can you imagine what he's talking like off camera? Skip, I've only met Russell a handful of times. I met him early in his career, his rookie season, and he, this is him. From what I gather, Skip, like I said, I haven't spent a whole lot of time around him, but what I've gathered, what you see is what you get.
Okay.
And, the videos, and he's buying his wife, and I don't have a problem with that. The man loves his wife. He found someone.
Allegedly, he loves his wife. People are so, they're so confused about how Russell Wilson met Ciara and how they made that happen. Ciara is someone who was a pass-around in the industry. And she decided that she wanted to link up with someone who was more responsible and slowed down, and who also had a lot of money and a lot of fame. So she was handed the keys to Russell Wilson. That's how that works in the industry. Assets are given over to other assets. Think Nick Cannon and Mariah Carey. Both assets. And basically, Mariah Carey had the keys to Nick Cannon. Or maybe it was vice versa, who knows. But either way, they were both assets, as are Russell Wilson and Ciara.
I'm happy that he wants to spend the rest of his life with. And the things that they do together, they seem sincerely happy to me. I don't, what is that? Well, because we see that a lot. And sometimes,
You never know.
Exactly, Skip.
Skip Bayless knows that a lot of this shit is just smoke screens.
I'm just saying, if he comes off as that he really truly enjoys his wife, he enjoys being married, and the guy can play. I don't get what the gist of it is, Skip. I can see I would have.
Right, but once again, when you say you don't get what the gist of it is, are you saying that because of something substantive that was on Twitter? Or are you just using the Twitter trolls as an excuse to talk about race again?
A problem if he was trying to be something that he's not, as opposed to being this.
Okay, just let me remind everybody, he's been to 6 Pro Bowls in 9 years. That's really good.
Yes.
In the 2 Super Bowls he played, he didn't just play pretty well, he played great.
He played unbelievable.
Look at his QBRs against the Broncos. It was 88 scale 0 to 100.
Yes.
And then even in the loss to Tom Brady, he was spectacular. He had a QBR of 93. Mm-hmm. You would be...
And that's with the interception at the end of the game. So, I mean, Russell Wilson has been one of the most underrated players in the NFL for a very long time now. They were calling him a game manager, and in his first couple of years in the NFL, he led the league in passer rating. So,
pressed to find any quarterback who's played 2 or more Super Bowls who had QBRs like this.
Right.
He was special in both.
Yeah.
So you can't fault him as a player at all. And by the way, speaking of players, they just voted him not only into the top 100, they voted him number 2 to Lamar, who was obviously the runaway MVP.
Correct.
Okay, so the players are saying, we buy. We're sold.
Yes.
Okay, does he have enough street in him? When he plays, he does.
He does. He does.
Why the fuck would anybody want to have any street in them? Why would you want that? If you have street in you, that means that you've done things to harm your community. That's all that shit means to me. Now, if you want to use other adjectives like toughness or grit or hardness, things of that nature, then sure. But the term street, all that means is that you've been destroying your community. That's all.
And and that's the thing, Skip, you know, just street cred, and you try to be hard, or you didn't have any tattoos, he doesn't have facial hair, Skip, he doesn't have earrings. The man just goes out there and play. Let the man live. There's enough space for everybody. You know, if you want to have dreads, if you want to have like Fitz, that's cool too.
Yeah.
If you want to dress like Cam Newton, that's cool too.
No, it's not.
To be Russ, there's a space in the NFL for all of us to like be who we are authentically, and I believe that's who Russ is. So it never bothered me that he didn't swear. It never bothered me. So I just Skip, you be in a locker room with a guy and he's a certain way, you just leave him be. That's your thing. Do you?
I admire him greatly for doing him.
Yes.
Because it's not that easy when you're stuck with that label, and I'm sure he hears it and sees it, and you got to have guts. You got to have courage to say, no, this is who I am, and I'm going to be.
You know, Cordell Stewart caught a lot of that, Skip, because he wasn't, I guess people didn't think he was down, and the way he spoke and what he did, and then he got labeled as being gay. So I'm surprised that, you know, they didn't float that.
Right, but was Cordell Stewart labeled as being gay because of how he spoke, or was he labeled as being gay because of things that other teammates knew about him? I mean, I've been watching the NFL for 30 years now. It's not that often that players get labeled gay. I mean, that's an extreme, unless there's some type of substance behind it. But I mean, hey, that's his, whatever it is, that's his business. I do remember him being on the reality TV show where he was married to that dizzy black bro who now has moved on to other shit now. So I mean, who knows what the hell's going on?
Around with Russ, because, you know, if we're different, if you don't know what a guy's doing, you float that theory around. So,
Shannon Sharpe, are you projecting, brother? Sound like you projecting. Out of nowhere, he just started talking about players being accused of being gay, right? I've said this in other videos. It would not shock me at all, at all, if Shannon Sharpe, you know, if his back door swings both ways.
Russ, do you, bro?
Of course, everything I'm saying is alleged.
Keep balling out. You keep throwing 35 touchdowns with 7-8 picks. You be all right.
You'll be all right.
His confidence has always been very appealing to me. And the Seahawks have the 9th best odds to win the Super Bowl, according to Fox Bet. So just keep that in mind. We're going to...
But anyway, that's basically it on that. That's the end of the first edition, or the first entry into the series, What is Blackness, starring Mr. Russell Wilson. No one's ever really going to be able to answer the question of what is blackness because it doesn't exist. It's a hypothetical question for a hypothetical concept.